So now, tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Ali Velshi, celebrating the release of Small Acts of Courage, a heartfelt exploration of how we can breathe new life into the principles of pluralistic democracy and the legacy of 125 years of family history advocating for social justice, and the work of regular people who made a lasting commitment to fight for change even when success seemed impossible. Velshi is an award-winning journalist, host of Velshi, chief correspondent for MSNBC, a weekly economic contributor to NPR's Here and Now, and is also the host of Velshi Banned Book Club on NBC and the podcast. He has covered multiple U.S. midterm and presidential elections and significant news stories around the globe, including, but not limited to, extensive reporting in Central and Eastern Europe during the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. Where did my spot go? The Syrian refugee crisis from Turkey and Jordan, and the funeral of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. He has previously worked as an anchor and correspondent for Al Jazeera America and CNN, and is known for his immersive on-the-ground reporting and his interactive discussions with small groups, which form the basis of his ongoing series, Velshi Across America. He holds a degree in religion and an honorary doctorate of law from Canada's Queen's University. He serves on the board of several organizations, has been nominated for multiple Emmy Awards, and is the recipient of 2 National Headliner Awards and a Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award. Velshi is also the author of Gimme My Money Back and the Trump Indictments, and the co-author of How to Speak Money and the upcoming Open Spaces, which will be out in 2025. Velshi will be joined in conversation with Yamiche Alcindor. Alcindor is currently the Washington correspondent for NBC News and was previously the moderator for Washington Week and the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Alcindor is an award-winning journalist and a member of the National Association of Black Journalists and was named the organization's 2020 Journalist of the Year. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Ali Velshi and Yamiche Alcindor.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, thank you all for being here. I am so excited to be sitting down with Ali Velshi to talk about this book. It is a complete pleasure. I should tell you, I've had his voice in my head because I've had the pleasure of listening to the audiobook, which I would, apart from buying and reading the actual book, I think that the audiobook just shows you your personality and really brings it to life in a really amazing way. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for recording that book.
And the recording of the book is definitely the hardest part of it to me. I mean, it's harder than you'd think, given that I sort of talk for a living. But I did write it with the idea that it was going to be important as an audiobook. So I think there's some things, if you're reading it, that might be not feel grammatically all exactly the way it should be, but it's how I talk.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And thank you. This was such a big deal to me when I asked Yamiche, and I think within minutes she responded that as long as the schedule works, which is quite an asterisk with Yamiche given her life, but as long as the schedule works, she would do it. And I often say to people, and you know this, Yamiche, because I've invited you to be on other people's panels that have nothing to do with me, because I'm recommending you all the time, because Yamiche is a journalist of our time. She really, really is. So this is a huge honor for me to be here in conversation with you.
Well, thank you, and right back at you. I mean, a journalist of the time, of course. So in preparing for this, I thought, you've written other books, but this book is so different. The other books were about finances and the economy. This book is so much about your life, your identity, about your family history, but also about world history. So I want to start there. Why did you want to write this book, and what do you hope people take away from it?
Well, thank you for that. I think we're in a fraught time where I run into a lot of people, as I'm sure you do, who seem very a bit frustrated, a little bit frightened about things that feel existential, whether it's climate or wars around the world or the erosion of democracy here in the United States or the growth of authoritarianism and, around the world. And I think that what I wanted to sort of outline is that in my family's history, and this may be common to a lot of people, my ancestors did smaller things that would not necessarily be notable to the outside world to improve their particular situation, their family situation, the situation of those around them, and ultimately started to take on slightly bigger challenges. And I think this is how a lot of people work, including some of the famous people who we know have changed the world. They started off not by trying to boil the ocean, but by trying to fix something in front of them. And the concept of small kept coming back to me. The conversations I have with people today who, in their own communities, fight one of the greatest scourges of our time, and that is the banning of books. This happens locally, right? These are not national conversations. They are for me because I've got a banned book club, but this only happens and gets changed locally on your school boards, at your parents' associations, in your local city council, to some degree in your state. And you and I know when people express frustration with politicians and being out of touch and people being too old and whatever the case is, how many people have you and I talked to? Young legislators, young people around the world who are trying to fix something in particular. Look at these young legislators from Tennessee, right? They're trying to fix school shootings, right? They're famous now, and someone, people criticized them and said, they're just doing it for the media. And I remember Reverend Al said to me, of course they're doing it for the media. That was the whole point of the civil rights movement. We needed to get attention. We needed people to see what was going on so that they understand to change it. So I just keep coming back to the idea that small works, and courage just means don't clap yourself too hard on the back for voting. That's the price of admission. It's not democratic heroism. But it is the first thing we have to do. And we have elections. I was in Philadelphia last night, a local election in which 19% of people came out to vote. That stuff's got to end. You just came back from the South. There are places in the South in the United States where state legislators run unopposed. They are acclaimed for their positions. Can you imagine in 2024 people getting acclaimed to positions? So I wanted to write this book for people to read it and say, I can do little things right around me, and if we all do little things right around us, the world will actually change.
What's interesting is you talk about the little things, and I think about sort of my ancestors and the idea that, they do little things like move to a new country and leave everything behind, right? Like they feel like little things, but they're also things that sort
take
of
a lot of courage.
Yeah, that take a lot of courage. So I want to start off, or I want to ask you about how Gandhi really factors into the history of your family. Your grandfather was one of his youngest students. And that to me, I was thinking, small acts of courage, except that's huge. You have these huge figures and these huge things like apartheid that factor into your family's history. So I want to start first with that, with your grandfather and Gandhi, and go from there.
So my ancestors are from Gujarat in India. They, like many Indians in the 1800s, they left India. India was a place that was affected by severe droughts in the 1800s. Countries can often survive these things. India was once a country that could have survived that. It was almost a quarter of global GDP before it was colonized. By the time the British left India in 1948, it was 2% of GDP. So we can have a conversation another day about colonialism and how well it works. But the routes that they could take to get out of India, depending on where you were starting, you went where the boats went, and the boats went to Africa, generally speaking. Some went to the West Indies. Some people got to America and Europe. My family went to South Africa, and they're doing business in South Africa, and it was a small business. They had an accountant, a bookkeeper, basically. Outsider. He wasn't employed by them. He worked for a lot of people. One of his other clients was Gandhi, who had been in South Africa as a lawyer, and everybody knows that story. He showed up to fight one case and ended up staying there to fight apartheid. So the accountant introduces them, and they become friends. Gandhi was based in Johannesburg. My great-grandfather was based in Pretoria. Gandhi would have to come to Pretoria to negotiate with the government, and my great-grandfather would provide him with a horse-drawn wagon to do his work, and then he would sleep at my great-grandfather's house. And one day they're talking, and Gandhi says to my great-grandfather, people are a little bit weak. They don't have the stomach. They don't have the courage to do what has to be done to fight these unjust, racist laws. It wasn't apartheid at the time. Apartheid didn't become a word until 1947, but it was a pretty unjust, racist place. And my great-grandfather is thinking, I'm a businessman. This is not going to be good for business. This is not a good idea to send my son. He wants my grandfather to be his student on this commune that he's setting up to train people to be better activists. The point being, nobody wants to give anything up. Everybody thinks there are unjust laws. Everybody wants to say something about it, but nobody wants to actually do anything that costs them anything. So Gandhi started this little encampment, a place called Tolstoy Farm, in which the residents, the inmates, of which my grandfather was the youngest, 70 of them, they slept on the floor. They had 2 blankets, one to sleep on, one to cover yourself with, no hot water, no meat. It was entirely self-sustaining. You made your own clothes, you made your own food, all of this stuff. It was preparation to go to jail. It was preparation to say, if you are going to fight apartheid, you are going to get arrested. And if you can live like this, then jail's not going to scare you all that much. So my great-grandfather didn't love this idea, and he was trying all the excuses he could, which I guess it's a hard thing when Gandhi's the guy on the other side of the table. And he said, we are Muslims. You are Hindu. How can I send my child to your school? To which Gandhi responded, I will learn your religion and teach it to him. Gandhi learned Islam. Gandhi learned Christianity. Gandhi learned Judaism. He read all the scriptures. I've seen his actual books that he read, the scriptures he actually read. And my grandfather learned his religion from a Hindu. And interestingly enough, it influenced a lot of the way in which we grew up. My father was a vegetarian until, very late in life. But that Gandhian influence stayed with my family all the way through, and it ended up being a very big part of the story.
And as you think about that, I mean, talking about your father was also a history maker. I wrote it down because I was like, this is important to say. In 1987, he became the first South Asian and first Muslim to be elected to the Ontario legislature. Now, this is jumping ahead because there are a lot of countries, and I'm going to come back to them. But I wonder if you could talk a bit about, you have your grandfather, then your father, and then, of course, there's you. So I wonder, when you think about your lineage, how what they did impacts what you do today and the way you see the world.
Well, I grew up in politics. I grew up with a family that was always involved in politics, and if you follow politics closely, then you have to consume a lot of news, right? Because unless you go everywhere, how are you going to know what's going on? So I grew up thinking the news was really important. It was really formative to me, and that's why I wanted to get involved. But I didn't think of myself as a link in any chain. I thought when my parents finally made it to Canada, they're the 4th country in my family's lineage, they had found the democracy they were looking for. We weren't going to keep worrying about this. That fight was over, which I think is a mistake many of us have made, thinking that fight is over. And what I started to learn is the fight's never, ever over. But when you think about it, my grandfather, when he died before I was born, died thinking that all of this work, starting from when he was 7 years old, a student on Gandhi's farm, he thought he had failed. He literally died thinking, it didn't work. I devoted my life to this, and I didn't make a difference. He would not have imagined that his son lived in Canada. He would not have imagined me doing what I'm doing. He certainly couldn't have imagined this. This would have been illegal. This whole gathering was illegal the entire time my grandfather was alive. None of this could have happened. None of this conversation could have happened. And in there, by the way, there are a couple other things. My mother was a candidate for federal office and withdrew. She was going to win. She withdrew because my grandmother had fallen ill, her mother-in-law, and in our culture, there's a sort of a, my grandmother wanted my mother to look after her in her final days. But my mother was a candidate. My sister was a candidate for local office, endorsed by all the major publications for what she did. So it's all over my family. This idea of public service. I'm the odd one out by going into journalism.
That's so interesting because there are no journalists in my family either, and part of it is because I'm from Haiti, where people don't go into the media because
Right.
It's a dangerous field to go into.
Why don't you get a real job? Why don't you do
Right.
something that will actually earn
Well,
you?
there's that too. I mean,
Yeah.
my father was calling me my senior year of college from Haiti, which costs about $20 a call, telling me, "Why are you not going to law school?" Your
That's
mother tells
exactly
me
the conversation
that
we
you're
had
going
with
to
my mom.
right.
Yeah.
So there's that. But I want to for people who aren't familiar with your backstory, as you said, there are all these different countries in your lineage before you get to the U.S. So talk to people a bit about sort of how you go from your family starting almost 100 years ago in India to the U.S. But maybe you can even stop with Canada, and I can go to the U.S. there. So maybe take us from India to Canada.
So India was in 1893 to about 1900. My family, it was these big Indian families, so it takes a few years for everybody to go and then bring the family behind them. But by about 1900, they're in South Africa, and they remained there until 1961. And they'd started as business people, as many Indians are, but I grew up thinking they were business people. They really started with push carts, wheelbarrows, basically. One would sell vegetables and another one had dried goods. Anyway, it became businesses over the years. They got a gas station and a bakery, and my grandfather and my father were running the bakery. It was a big industrial bakery. Like when I say big industrial bakery, commercial bakery, they baked 4,000 loaves of bread an hour. But they were funneling money and engaging in activities that were supporting the anti-apartheid movement. The government got frustrated by that and eventually destroyed the bakery. And my family finally left. They went to Kenya, which was amazing to them because they get to Kenya, which is not an independent country at the time, and it was still a British colony, and it still was a very racist society, but it didn't have that explicit racism that South Africa had. In other words, people could walk on the same sidewalk together. There weren't different races at the movie theater and different theaters for different people of different races. It was still a pretty racist society, but what they got to see by moving to Kenya was the dawn of democracy. They went to a country in 1961 that was not a democracy, and they got to watch it become an independent country. The day the British flag came down and the Kenyan flag went up. And they had such remarkable hopes because all they had tried to do all those decades was be in a place where you were equal, not by virtue of the color of your skin or your religion or whatever. You were just all equal. You were citizens. And it was working out relatively well, but alongside of that, there were a lot of Asians in Kenya and in Tanzania. I have some friends here from Tanzania, and Uganda. Uganda got really bad, as you recall, and a lot of that sentiment was flowing around. So if you were Asian in East Africa at the time, you faced some issues. And I write about this. A lot of Indians in the diaspora are not sure where they stand, right? They're not sure. In some cases, they were fighters for freedom and independence. In some cases, they were a little closer up to the whites than they were to the blacks, and they were fine with that. This is a big issue that Gandhi had in South Africa. It's like Indians have got to decide where they are. But that's the nature of diasporic communities. But my parents understood that there was a nationalist movement that was developing post-independence in Kenya, which is understandable and valid, right? These Africans had felt that they were discriminated against for so long, and now they had independence, and they didn't sometimes have the space for other people in the movement. And that also goes to South Africa. It goes to all sorts of independence movements where people didn't feel they wanted to do it on their own. So my parents were not feeling that they were completely fulfilled in their desire to be entirely full participants in a democracy. And that's how they ended up in Canada. And they jumped in with both feet when they got to Canada. They went to every political party's meetings to try and figure out where they would feel welcomed. And not 10 years into being in Canada, my father decided he would run for office in what seemed like a ridiculous decision because nobody of his sort had ever been elected to major office anywhere in Canada. That was in 1981.
So as I was listening to this book, something that really struck me, and I was talking to you about it right before we came on, was this idea that you write about how you could sort of fully embrace Canada and become Canadian, but your sister, who I love, because I could just hear sort of her looking around as a 9-year-old saying, like, what are we doing here?
Right.
And
why do you keep moving me?
Right, and not having the same experience. So talk a bit about the difference between how your sister saw Canada and how you saw Canada, and what that tells us really about sort of when people get up to move. Your parents are moving, but they're also sort of moving for reasons that are not just, oh, I really like the house on this website. They're moving for real reasons that are going to impact their lives.
Yes, they were in search of something that looked and felt like democracy, whatever that means to them. My sister was born in South Africa. She grew up in Kenya, which was, by the way, in those days, a fairly multicultural society. So she shows up in Toronto with my parents. I was a little baby at the time.
A skinny baby.
A skinny baby. I was a very small little baby. She shows up, and again, being 9, she doesn't really have the full context of why are we moving again? What's going on here? We lived a pretty privileged life in Kenya. And so I grew up almost entirely in Canada. I had none of these issues, right? I was the only person in my immediate family who was not prevented from doing anything by law because of the color of my skin. For whatever reason, for my sister, including when she went back to South Africa, when we went back for a visit, it really had an impact on her. She really feels that she was cheated out of her youth and her rights as a child. And that really influenced her growing up, because what she did is she took that grievance, which many of us have for various reasons today, she took it and she channeled it toward public service. So she became a public servant. She then worked for people who had elected office, and she was that person who fixed the little things that weren't getting fixed in society. It's all driven and fueled by a certain amount of frustration with the fact that people get a raw deal. But rather than complaining about it, she went out and said, you know what, I think you might be getting a raw deal. I'm here to help. And that's how she was driven by this. I was actually relatively lazy by comparison. I lived in a society that was pretty fair, or I thought so. I wasn't part of a struggle. I knew that my family had been part of a struggle, but I didn't really realize how it connected to me. And now, strangely, in 2024, the irony is that we're all part of a struggle. We're all in this soup together. How many people tell you, what a great job, you have a front seat to everything that happens, you have a front seat to history? It's like, we're in it. There's no front seats. We're in the arena. Yeah. And that's, long answer to your first question, that's why the book. Because it's a realization now that we are all in this thing, and that's my connection to my ancestors.
And I want to ask you about your own identity, but just going back to your sister, who again I just loved hearing about her, because she's learning about apartheid and has this memory of from a zoo. I hope I'm not giving away too much of the book, but has this memory that she had where she was denied something at the zoo, and I want you to tell the story that connects her to history in a way that sticks with her.
Yes, that's right. So my parents had left South Africa, but we still had some interests and family there and stuff. So at one point, my father's brother, who was very, very involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, had a heart attack. So it wasn't the easiest thing for my family to go back, but they went back to South Africa on a small visit. I think I wasn't even 2 yet. Skinny baby. I fell between it was 2 beds put together, and I fell, and nobody could find me.
He wasn't hurt. He slept apparently under the bed.
I fell and fell straight asleep. They established I was there, and there was nowhere to go. It was a small room. So on that very same trip, my sister went with a relative to the Pretoria Zoo, and walks in, and she really loved horses, and there was a pony ride. They were offering pony rides to people, so she goes up and she wants to have a pony ride. Well, the pony rides were not for my sister. The pony rides were for white kids. And she had not registered this because she'd been out of the country since she was very young. So she'd never felt it. As a 9-year-old child, she didn't understand it. I was going to say she felt apartheid. I don't know. What do you feel when that happens? And it scarred her deeply. It stayed with her. That basic injustice of not being able to ride a pony at the zoo was how civil injustice and racism and apartheid manifested. Now, obviously, apartheid had 6 million ways of manifesting, and it is a profoundly stupid but Byzantine and intricate thing that I write about in the book. I mean, they had a law for everything. But this is the one that hit my sister. And it was the thing that made her feel cheated out of her, what you should have as a child. If you lived in South Africa and you grew up in South Africa, you just knew not to try stuff like that. You didn't ask for the pony ride at the zoo. You didn't do things that you weren't supposed to do. But she had grown up in multicultural Kenya where stuff like that didn't happen. So she feels it to this day, where I feel, hey, I had this sort of fairly happy-lucky upbringing, and now I should use my voice to try and make things better. She really feels like stuff always has to be fixed, and you've got to have your finger on the pulse to make sure, because that injustice is not happening today. Other injustices are happening, and she wants to find them and fix them.
Yeah. Well, a really great part of the book that really, I think, stuck with me and will stick with me, just imagining, because now I have an 11-month-old son, and I just imagine someone telling him you can't do something because you're African American. That would stick with you.
Right.
So one thing that we were talking about backstage, I grew up in a household with Haitian immigrants who had come here in the 1970s. My grandmother didn't speak any English. My mother came here at 22 with a crop top on. She was a little bit closer to the American version than my grandmother. But I grew up in a household where I was told over and over again, this is Haiti, outside is America. That is my upbringing. So it was beat into me almost, not physically, but in my mind. You should be proud of your heritage. You should be proud that you're Haitian. Tell everyone you're Haitian. And it's not so much that your parents weren't proud of their heritage, but you were able to sort of fully be Canadian. And when people asked you, you wouldn't think, oh, I'm Indian, even though your grandmother, her clothing was traditional Indian clothing, and the food you were eating was Indian. But tell me a little bit about that, because it struck me so much, because as someone who was grown up to really, I didn't have an option, right? I couldn't embrace America all the way, even if I wanted to in some ways, because my parents said, we're Haitian too.
Yeah, it was funny growing up in my situation, because my grandmother wore a sari every single day of her life. She spoke Gujarati to me, which I could understand. I didn't really speak it much. She liked to go to Indian movies, which I couldn't understand either, but they had a good snack bar. So I would go with her to those things. But she also, every Christmas, put up lights and a little Christmas tree. Because she thought that was a really neat little thing. Look at all these people on our street. And we grew up in Toronto in the 1970s. Like 99.8% of people had Christmas trees and lights. She thought that was a lovely tradition. And remember that they had all grown up in an environment where you were so super defined by the color of your skin that there was a relatively active push in my family to make sure that didn't happen. Now, that was definitely not a denial of culture under any circumstances. We were very clearly culturally Indian. We ate Indian food. I was always distraught when my mother would put leftovers in a container for me to take to school, because everybody else had a ham and cheese sandwich on white bread, and I had samosas, and it was crazy. But I didn't identify with it, and I didn't identify with anything really, because the culture was Indian. The experience that my family had for the 75 years prior was in South Africa and motivated by the thoughts of apartheid and racial injustice. I was born in Kenya, so when you're a little kid, you think about what you are based on where you were born, which, by the way, nobody in Toronto knew anything about any of these things. So the kids didn't know any different. So what was I at that point? And then we're in Canada, and my parents, not wanting to confuse the issue further, were sort of about, let's see if we can, mix with this culture. It wasn't assimilation. It was just what can you take from here so that you can grow up as a full participant? So here I am with sort of these 4 culture background things. It was easier to do nothing, or to lean into nothing, than to think about it too much.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fascinating to hear, and I think it's really important to make the point they weren't denying their culture. No. It was just that they were embracing it. And I would say the same thing. As much as my mother was embracing Haitian culture, she wasn't denying American culture. She loved her crop top that she would not have been able to wear in Haiti. She loved being able to go to the amazing schools that America had to offer. She loved being here and still loves being here. But there is this idea that she was very concerned that I was going to sort of leave Haiti behind, which now with my own young son, I think, oh my God, I want him to also know that he had a Haitian great-grandmother who came here, who didn't speak English, who left her whole family behind at 62. I want him to know that he's American for a reason, but at the same time, I want him to be able to embrace the fact that he's an American.
But isn't that the beautiful texture of immigration, right? That's not the story you hear these days, but that's the texture of every single one of us has a story like that. Something like, how was your upbringing a little different than mine, or different than somebody else's? And yet somehow in this great country, through this strength of immigration and what I truly believe to be a welcoming and fantastic country, we all adjust, and we all make it better, right? It doesn't really, we all turn out okay. You and I had sort of different ways of coming to it, and yet today we are both national journalists working for MSNBC, discussing and reporting the most important issues of our time. So it all worked.
It did all work. It did all work. I told you to stop at Canada because you also tell the story in the book of how you came to be an American and the fact that it took you 18 years to be a U.S. citizen. And you especially talk about Ashley Banfield, who was really, I think, I'll let you tell the story, but I love the fact that she kind of was like, no, like U.S. citizenship is something that you should be sort of going after in a way that you weren't thinking about it in the same way.
So it speaks to that whole laziness, right? The intellectual laziness of, what do I need any of this for? I had a green card, it was all fine. And I worked with Ashley Banfield at CNN at the time, and she asked me, she'd become an American citizen, and she said, why haven't you? And I said, probably I shouldn't have said this. I said, because then I'd have to do jury duty. And she lit into me. But it was, what she said to me was very interesting. I don't know if any of you watch her. She's a person of big reaction, so you can imagine how this conversation went. And a good friend of mine. She said something along the lines of, citizenship is not just a series of rights. It comes with some obligations. And if you're going to tell me that you're not going to become an American citizen because you don't want to do jury duty, it's like, become an American citizen and do jury duty if you have to. Like, that's just a silly thing to say. You are here, you benefit from the fruits of this country, and if there are some obligations you have to do that, you should. And it really made sense then. It makes a lot more sense now when I realize that the actual obligations of citizenship go well beyond things like jury duty, which I still haven't done. They are actually obligations to ensure that this more perfect union that we seek, that this country in which people enjoy equal rights and liberties, we're not there yet. And until we are there, until we're all there, none of us are there. And that's the thing that we have to discuss. And something struck me today. I read an article today that said that the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, is making a push to have men understand that abortion restrictions are their problem too. You wrote that article. You were reporting on it today. And this is the point, right? Like in South Africa, when my parents were growing up, what, 5%, 6% of the population, I think, had rights, but their democracy was great. For the 6% who had rights, it was a real democracy. They got to choose their prime minister and everything went well. 94% of people didn't have a vote. So if today half of our society does not enjoy the rights I do, and that is a fact, right? Today in America, women, you can say that you live in places where abortion is legal, but you know that abortion is under threat. Abortion rights are under threat. LGBTQ rights are under threat for every American. And if they're under threat, then my democracy is not yet complete. And so that's how I now interpret what Ashley was saying. She was just talking about jury duty, but I think she had a bigger message in mind, saying there is work for you to be done. When you take your citizenship up, you become a foot soldier in the pursuit and protection of democracy. So do it.
Yeah, a powerful message. We're about to open it up for questions, so if you have any questions, start thinking about it, because I have one more question before I let everyone else start asking you questions. And that is that the prologue of this book, you talk about the modern times. You talk about being shot by a rubber bullet, covering the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd. And you talk about sort of the sense of being an American, feeling different and dawning on you in a new way because of that moment. Tell us about that and the moment that we're living through now.
Yeah, that was really the moment where all of this that I'm talking to you about crystallized for me, because I was reporting on what was an entirely peaceful protest. I'm not even sure protest the right word. It was like a walk in which people were singing sort of peace songs and things like that. And all of a sudden, into the intersection in front of us comes these National Guard and state police and Minneapolis police, and they deployed tear gas, and they started shooting tear gas canisters and rubber bullets and things like that. And most people can't take tear gas, right? We have masks, so we can hang around in it, but most people have to bolt. A small percentage of people can actually withstand tear gas. But at that point, probably, I don't know, 2/3 of a block were between the police and me because everybody else had gone. Now we're walking backwards. This is all on video. This happened live on TV. We're walking backwards. My head of security, who's a former New York police lieutenant, was fascinated. You could just hear it in his voice. It's like, they're shooting at us. And he's pulling me back. Guy next to me got hit by something, and then I suddenly got hit in the leg with a rubber bullet, which, as I mentioned, is a rubber-coated actual bullet. It's not a Nerf. And in that moment, I sort of realized that this is sort of coming undone, right? This is coming undone. We are realizing that the fabric of the police are shooting at journalists. They opened fire on a peaceful crowd, which subsequently Donald Trump would go on to describe as Berlin, which just wasn't true. The stuff that you heard wasn't true. And I realized at that point that this battle to preserve fairness and democracy depends on an informed electorate. Informed electorates depend on journalists to do two things. And Yamiche and I do both of these every day. They're two separate roles that we have, and every journalist should have these two things. One is that you bear witness. I write about a journalist who covered the Darasan assault march in India, and he was the only journalist there. And he filed the dispatch, and it was how these things became known to the world, and people started to say, hey, maybe this colonialism thing in India is not working so well. So we bear witness because all of you are busy doing whatever it is you do on a daily basis, so we tell you X happened. But once you know that X happened, it is also on us to hold power to account. So that very next morning, after I got hit by the rubber bullet, I'm on TV, the governor is on television, the attorney general of Minneapolis, and they're answering to the idea that they opened fire on journalists. That's a really bad thing in society. It's not about my leg. It's about the fact that once you are okay with that, doesn't matter where you stand on the political spectrum, we don't shoot journalists. We don't shoot peaceful protesters. You know, we have to pull this thing together. And it was then when I realized that I didn't see that I had any role in activism for democracy. But I have strong views on hurricanes being really bad for people. I have strong views on homicide being really bad for people. I also have strong views on democracy being really important for people. And if I have to be an activist for democracy, I can do that while still being a journalist, while still bearing witness and holding power to account. And all that was swirling through my brain that one Saturday night in Minneapolis.
We're not going to open it up for questions. From my understanding, we're going to have microphones, or are people just going to stand up? Oh, the microphones.
You got
okay,
microphones?
Use a microphone.
I got two quick shout-outs. Maya, in that fantastic, lovely shirt there, is my production assistant and has been helping me throughout this whole thing. And standing next to her is Daisy, who was very involved in helping me fact-check this book. And in case I got any facts wrong, it definitely wasn't Daisy. That was the ones I was handling. So it's great to see you, my old friend. Thank you to both of you for being so central to this.
Good evening. How are you? My name is Dr. Omekongo Dibinga. I'm a professor at American University. And I want to applaud you for a very large act of coverage with your banned book club.
Thank you.
This is very powerful. The second large act of coverage is what my question is about. When you travel the country to engage in conversations with people of diverse backgrounds on the election and everything, I found that to be very powerful in my space and intercultural communication. So my question is, one, what did you learn from that experience? And two, are you going to do it again going into the election?
So thank you for that. I just want to remind everybody that the courage in fighting book bans are people out there, right? All I'm doing is I literally am highlighting authors, and I'm highlighting people who are pushing back they're getting people elected in their communities. It's fantastic. And reading a lot of books in the process. So it's exciting. I mean, it's great because it's actually a book club. The reasons for banning books, there are only like 4 reasons. They're the same 4 reasons they've always been. But then you actually study the books, and you study the authors and why they use the language they use. And nothing makes me more excited than when I walk by a bookstore and I see a banned book section where people are reading books that they certainly wouldn't have chosen because it wouldn't have come to them. They wouldn't have known it, right? And the same thing happened with Black Lives Matter, right? People were forced to say, I don't really understand this in much detail. And people would say, well, here's some good books you should read. And then people got smarter about it. So banning books is this is just nonsensical. Like, this is a non-starter. It's the most obvious thing in the world. Don't ban books, don't burn books. Nothing good ever came of that. On the second part, this series that I do called Velshi Across America, it is truly one of the finest times I've ever had as a journalist, right? I go into places where I hear stories directly from people about their experience without any sense of judgment. I'm not even a host in those environments. I'm literally just a facilitator of people telling me their stories. So here's things I learned. I went into the Deep South several times, but for 2 different issues. One was after the murder of George Floyd and the sort of reckoning around policing and racial issues, coexistence. I then went in after COVID, where a lot of Black Americans, based on things that they had heard in their families and experiences that they have had and real bad things that have happened, were really hesitant about taking vaccines. We had frank conversations where everybody was entitled not to be judged for whatever their opinions were. And my only job was making sure, and I had people with different perspectives, but making sure that everybody can just talk and be heard. I set up very basic ground rules when I arrived on the scene, and I said, you can say anything you want, and we will definitely not misrepresent you in the edit, but we're going to talk for 2 hours, and it's only going to be 20 minutes on TV. I was just speaking to two gentlemen from New Mexico right there, right? And I was saying the last time I was in New Mexico was because I was in Albuquerque because I had just come from the Navajo Nation to discuss, amongst many things, the disappearance of Native women and how that is absolutely erased from the reality of what we talk about today. Absolutely erased. The number of Native women who simply have disappeared and will be found dead in an unmarked grave is a national catastrophe. It is also in Canada, just so you know. This is not, I write a lot about how Canada does everything right, doesn't do that right. These are things that don't make it into the mainstream. So until you give people the same voice that an expert has or that Yamiche has on my show, you don't get the fullness and the texture of the conversation. So I think it is, these two things you've mentioned are the heart and soul of what I enjoy doing as a journalist. Going out there, imagine somebody pays you to go out and ask people what they really feel and what they really believe, and to validate those feelings without necessarily agreeing with them, but validate them, and then let that inform you when you have conversations with people who make policy decisions. So when I hear this from our Native American brothers, I now have something to say to our lawmakers about it. When I hear things from my African-American brothers and sisters, I now have something, I can take their voice and then speak to lawmakers, governors, senators, about the things that I've heard from them. And it's not me making it up. It's me saying, I heard these people say this. What do you have to say about that? So thank you for that.
More questions?
Thank you so much. My name is Jory Scott. I'm a professor at George Washington University, and I'm the dean at a girls' school. And I hear what you're saying about banned books, but one of the concerns that I'm seeing, and I'm working on my dissertation on banned books.
Excellent.
But one of the things is some of our young people don't even know what a banned book is, and we're not enabling them to understand critical thinking,
Right.
which to me is a bigger issue than not reading. Would you
Well,
comment
okay,
on
so
that, please?
so you've actually hit on, I think it's the biggest issue. And when I go around the world, it's literally the biggest issue. So when you look at the war in Ukraine, the disinformation and the misinformation to which people are subject is so remarkable because people consume bad information. And so I would be speaking to young Ukrainian kids whose parents identify as Russian, because that used to be the case in Ukraine, that Russians and Ukrainians kind of overlapped a lot, and there was a lot of, there was a lot of intercultural exchange. So these parents identify as Russian, the kids, and they are in either Crimea or Russia. The kids are in Ukraine. They'll text their parents in Ukrainian to say, a missile has just landed where I am, and the parents will text them back in Russian to say, that's propaganda. And they will tell me that their parents consume the equivalent of highly propagandized cable news in Russia, which is the only kind you can get now. And I said, do they have an ability to consume better information? And every single one of them said, of course they do. Everybody's got a VPN. Everybody knows how to get it. But in America, you don't need a VPN to consume better information, and people still choose to consume information that suits their prevailing narrative. So you're actually on to the more important point here, and that is critical thinking is more important than whether we rearrange our curricula to decide whether it's biology or coding or whether it's this or that. It is the ability to discern for yourself when someone is hoodwinking you. And that's the problem with banned books, that we are, before people are able to employ their critical thinking skills, we're just taking certain things away from them. That's the wrong part. Now, that's not to say that everything that's banned is fantastic and Pulitzer Prize winning. It's the fact that the library and the school, as much as we respect and honor these institutions, the people who work at them, and we really, really, really do, we love public libraries, they are the state. And the state should not be making decisions as to what you consume. The state should not be making decisions about your health. They should not be making decisions about your medical care, about your reproductive health, about who you love and who you marry. That's just a basic, fairly libertarian perspective on life. So yes, if we could solve critical thinking, that would solve all of our problems. The book banning is just a symptom of a much larger problem. Absolutely. Done.
More questions? More questions?
Hi, sorry, I'm not a professor. I'm so I might not be right. First of all, Yamiche, I didn't know you were going to be here. I'm really excited. Thank you for coming too. I just because you guys are in DC and how important everything about democracy is right now, I was wondering. This is more a favor than a question, I guess. Maybe use your platform for talking about DC statehood and DC voting rights, because it's really hard to be so scared and not feel like you have like any voice.
Yeah, it's a remarkable issue that people who are not from places in which you are an American citizen but do not share the same ability to vote, other people don't think about this a lot, right? But if you are going to start addressing this idea of until we all are equal, none of us are equal. If any of us are in chains, all of us are in chains. That's how we need to be thinking about this, right? I understand that there are all sorts of reasons for this, but in the end, when you are scared about the existential nature of democracy, as we are, or at least as I am and you are, and I think probably we should be right now, the idea that, as I said, voting is the price of admission, right? That's the least you should be doing in a democracy, right? We should all be showing up and voting 100% of the time. There are things you can't vote for in the District of Columbia, which doesn't seem to me to be fair or equitable in 2024. We're still discussing whether people should be given food or water while they're waiting to vote, which I think is nonsensical too. I think we should have Jose Andres giving like food trucks to everybody. Like, why are we discussing this? But you're really right to bring that up. Part of the problem, and I want to hear your take on this, Yamiche, but part of the problem with like this issue of missing Native women, or this issue of being able to vote, or statehood in DC, is that right now we're worrying about existential threats to democracy. So everything, including the existential threat of climate change, now becomes secondary to the fact that if we vote out our democracy, which is how most autocracies are born, they are not born of revolution, they're born of people giving up their rights. If we do that, then all of these things fall farther down the line. So that's the biggest waste in the last 7 years, is all the important things like you're talking about that don't get talked about enough, that don't get covered enough, because we're all trying to save democracy. So I agree with you. You're 100% right.
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who lives in the District of Columbia, I would love to have voting rights, right? I would love to have a senator and a representative. But I think to your point, there is this society that we're living in is so polarized. So the minute you bring it up, there are ways to fix it. That you have Republicans who are saying, we'll just become part of Maryland, and you have Democrats who are saying, well, let's just make it a state. Both of those things have real consequences, because we're all living in a society where gerrymandering is also really deciding for a lot of districts sort of what kind of representation you get. So I think it's an important issue. But as you said, I mean, let's think about what's on the news right now. And this is someone who it's not a criticism of anything, but I know I spent half my time, as much as I was interviewing literally the second gentleman yesterday about men, about abortion rights. I think a very important story. He was talking about anti-Semitism. We were talking about the war between Israel and Hamas and sort of civilian deaths in Gaza. I think a really important conversation. I spent half my day also looking at Stormy Daniels and what she was saying on the stand, right? It's like if we're honest with ourselves, it's like there's like the sort of vegetables and the things we should be talking about, and then there's Stormy Daniels on the stand, and you're like, wait, what? So I think if we're honest with each other, part of it is that the news is so crazy.
The news is crazy.
Right?
Yes, that's right.
That you also can't look away from. I would love to say oh no, my story should have been in all over. And it's Stormy Daniels was a story. Right? I
true.
can't argue with that.
It's true. I was supposed to be on TV all day yesterday, and I got blown out by that too. So yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And in that case, it's can I argue about it? Not quite, because I'm reading it too.
Yeah.
Next, other questions. I think they had some people back there.
Hello, good evening. My name is Joseph, and I'm coming from the Philippines. and I'm also an aspiring diplomat. I actually just got my invitation for the officer assessment
Oh, amazing.
next month.
Congratulations.
So
Congratulations.
I'm also a news junkie, and my question is regarding to your profession as a news anchor. You've shared stories nationwide, but also across the world. I'm not sure if this applies to you, but do you ever get overwhelmed by what's going on in the world, but also what are your coping strategies, or what do you advise for people like us who doesn't have the platform?
Yeah.
And I guess lastly, do you see like a fatigue in just
yeah.
consumption of media?
You hit on all the things. So first of all, yes, there's a fatigue with consumption. And that's so hard when some of the stories we're talking about are about people dying, about hostages, about Ukraine, about the tens of millions of innocent Russians who are actually subject to a government that they didn't choose, that is doing things in their name that they don't choose. So yeah, the fatigue is very, very real. People say it to me. Oh, I used to watch you on TV all the time. And I'm like, what do you mean we used to? And they think that because of the results of the last election, they're safe. So that's one thing. Thank you for asking such an empathetic question about how we manage these things. It is very hard. It is very hard. And the one thing I've learned over the years is it doesn't get easier. I'm not better at it. I'm not better. When I go to a school shooting, and I've done all of them, it is the worst thing in the world. When I landed in Israel on October 8th, it was the worst thing in the world. I mean, in 30 years, I don't think I've covered a story like this. It's just horrible. It's just horrible. I cover hurricanes. I cover tornadoes. I'm often there when people come to their home. I'm there before they get there. I'm there as they approach because we get behind police lines. To see somebody come back to their home and walk through and start to pick up pictures or things like that. Now, I will tell you, all of this has a flip side. And what it does is it demonstrates to me the strength of the human spirit. I have the horrible privilege of speaking to somebody after they've learned that someone they know has died. They've lost a child. They've lost their house. I spoke to a number of people who had hostages in their family. I've spoken to a number of Gazans, a number of Palestinians. It does remind me that the human spirit is substantially stronger than we believe it is. People can withstand more than they think. But what I have learned as a journalist is that we are not immune to this stuff. In fact, NBC asked me about a year ago to moderate an internal discussion about how to deal with the trauma of shootings. Because as much as I'm there, producers go through the footage. They see much more than I do. And the footage for everything you see on TV is 2% of what's actually out there. It's gruesome, horrible stuff. And I thought to myself, how am I equipped to talk to these people? I don't have any particular meaningful coping strategy. I don't go and talk to a therapist after seeing. It's not normal to see dead bodies. It's not normal to see the things that we do to each other. So I've started to learn, and I've talked to a lot of my colleagues about the fact that we have to be honest with ourselves. What we are experiencing in 2024 in this world, all over the world and here in this country, it is not normal. It should not be normal. It should not feel normal. And if you got to cry, that's what you got to do. If you got to reach out to people to say, this is really, really hard. And I feel it, Yamiche. I will say, some days even the existential discussions about democracy and our polarization, I feel it. Like, I feel like this is, I don't know, like it's hard to live through this every day and still pretend that life's okay and everything's going to be okay. But I do lean into the people who prove to me that they are stronger than we think that they should be.
Yeah, and I'd say, I mean, for me, I think being a new mom, I spend a lot of time when I go home, I will turn off the TV and just like spend two hours just playing with my kid and looking at my kid and thinking, okay, like no matter what happens, like this kid thinks I'm great, and we'll just go there no matter if I messed up my live shot or if I'm really, really sad about something. So I think leaning into your family, leaning into my husband, to my mother who has taken up residence in DC because she has found a new favorite person. So I think all of that is really important. I also think talking about, to me, the village that you create with your friends and your family, talking about all this, I think I think it's showing up in polls. This idea of like double haters. Everyone kind of hates everything right now. Talking to people, I think there are a lot of people who we're all going through this sort of PTSD of the fact that we lived through a complete pandemic. We all thought we were gonna die. Like it was like, I feel like there were all these things that happened along the way that we just sort of popped back up and said, okay, I think I'm going back to work now. And it's like, what? So I think for me, it's also sort of being real with myself, and I take breaks. I mean, if I need a day off, I take a day off. Like, and I think that that's probably un-American because I think we work so much. I think especially now in my new life as a mom, I knew that I worked a lot, but I think being away from somewhere where you want to be really brings home the idea that we work a lot. But that's also our culture, right? Everyone's basically at work more than you are anywhere else. And whether you're a teacher or a lawyer or whatever you do for a living, that's just very much the American thing that we do. So I also think just really taking a break when you can and being real with yourself is super helpful for me.
I agree.
Other questions?
Yes. First, I want to thank both of you for what you bring into our living rooms.
Hold that up because I want everybody to hear you.
Oh, yeah. I usually have a big voice. First, I want to thank both of you for what you bring into at least my living room.
Thank you.
And the kind of critical thinking that you bring to us. But I think both of you touched on the point and what you talk about in your book, small acts. In my youth, we were both talking about, we have a similar background professionally. I was a news producer in my hometown in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the NBC affiliate, until I couldn't do it anymore. And I couldn't fight every day. I heard a speaker once say, if you are first at something and you're an only, and if you're not prepared to do battle, go home. So when I reached my limit, I went home and I did something else. But part of what you say in terms of the small acts and doing the small things, if we don't see it, we don't know to do it. And that's the challenge in terms of what's taken over what was on the news today versus looking at real problems. I am constantly thinking about the comparison, the visual comparison, how the other in this country got involved in the civil rights movement when they saw children being hosed and attacked by dogs during the civil rights movement. Then more the other folks got involved, and it wasn't just people of Black people and a few non-Black people. College students now see the ugly. It's in front of you to see children starving to death. And your humanity has, when you see the ugly, you do your small part. And the news often takes that away. We want to clean up. We want to show a happy story versus look at the real problems here. Look at the real challenges here. And so I applaud you for what you do and what you bring us.
Thank you. And I, pleased to say I haven't done a happy story in about 5 years, but no, I hear your point. And how we curate the news is really important. So to the point that this gentleman made behind you earlier, that's why we like to go out and try and have these conversations with people who are not sort of in front and center in the news, because you just need to know it. Even if you just file it away, maybe you can't do anything about it, but we need to know more because we do have to curate. And one of the problems is, you know, resources are slimmer than they used to be. So as a result, Yamiche has to go somewhere and cover some story, and someone's going to determine that this is the most important one that has to be covered, or the biggest, or the broadest. And it's the same thing with us. We have a show. I've got 2 hours on Saturday and 2 hours on Sunday, but there's 2,000 hours of news, right? So the how you curate it is a constantly evolving conversation that I really love to have with viewers. And if not for what you just said, I'd have abandoned social media entirely, because I don't want to really hear from what most people have about my offer to most people who complain about me is I'll send you 2 batteries to change you put in your remote and change the channel. Because if I hated anybody as much as you seem to hate me, I wouldn't watch them. But what I do like is people telling me, why don't you cover these stories? Right? I think the robots are coming for us. Why don't you cover these stories? And sometimes it's meant as a criticism, but often they're right. Why don't we cover those stories? So it's a good criticism to have of us. Thank you.
So we're almost out of time, right? Yeah, so we have one last question.
Hi, Madalika, recovering journalist. Ali.
And what? Recovering journalist and?
Currently a book editor, nonfiction book editor.
The head of an imprint.
Not quite.
Many books in
quite.
this place are yours.
I was struck by 2 things you said about being a journalist. First was to bear witness. and second, the role that you play in a democracy. And I don't know, it might put you on the spot. You may have heard that the editor of a national newspaper this week seemed to downplay that part about a role to play in democracy, and that the role of the newspaper was to reflect what people were thinking. And, you know, I worked in mainstream news organizations, you both work in mainstream news organizations. I'm just really interested in your take on that, particularly given your family's history in the role of democracy. And I know it's self-serving, I'm not a journalist anymore, but I will say it, the role of journalism in a democracy is so important.
Yeah.
And Ali is right. Most autocracies start off as democracies. And if you're not paying attention to India, you should, because this is exactly
And
what's
you have every
happening.
chance to pay attention to it because the election's like 6 weeks long. So
Yes, but no one's covering it. That's a whole other story.
Right. Well, the world's largest democracy is now slipping further into autocracy, and we're not paying attention.
Right. So I'm just wondering on your take on this idea of if democracy is under threat, what do you see the role of a journalist? Because it is in some quarters seen as partisan to have the mission of trying to defend democracy.
I think that the distinction, and look, the history of this country is, and many countries, is that journalism and news has been partisan, in many cases owned by, still in some cases owned by interests that have political reasons for owning newspapers or TV stations. And in much of the world that we're talking about, where democracy is being undermined, including India, including Hungary, including Turkey, including Greece for some time, that's what you saw happen. You just saw mainstream media, and you wouldn't necessarily know it because the name of the TV station stays the same or the name of the publication stays the same, but weirdly it's all morphed into something that supports the same cabal of people who happen to run all of society. I think it still comes down to the bearing witness and the holding power to account. I have never been asked to not take a position on how damaging and horrible hurricanes are and how horrible school shootings are. Why is democracy different? Why can't I take a position on the fact that we are all here because we elected to be in a democracy, or our parents did, or our grandparents did? We have participated in building it. We are not independent of democracy. We are, in fact, the people who provide for an informed electorate who can make proper decisions. I guess there's a little bit of a line, and I don't know exactly where it is, between saying you should do this politically. But I think that we cannot, as mainstream journalists, skirt around the abuses of democracy that are taking place, the erosion of democracy, because what happens is then it happens, and then people wonder, how did that happen? How do we not know that? So currently there's a document out there called, it's a Project 2025. It's this idea of this is what's going to happen if Donald Trump wins election. I'm not giving you my opinion on what should happen. I'm giving you my opinion on the stuff that Project 2025 has some very scary stuff in it. And part of it, this is why this becomes important, part of it is a greater assumption of executive authority by the President of the United States if Donald Trump becomes president. Everybody's fine with that when your person is president. Everybody's fine with more power and gerrymandering that works in your favor. We have to decide we're not fine with it. We have to decide that this country was built on certain principles. Some of them have worked. Some of them, like our Electoral College, do not. But this concept of accountable branches of government and checks and balances is important. And if you just decide that you're going to vote for somebody and they're going to change all of that stuff, that is going to come back and haunt you at some point. And then it'll be very hard to change. So you can take that as biased. You can take that as me giving you information. I don't agree with those who say that, as a rule, we as mainstream journalists should not take positions as it relates to democracy. I do believe in a very pluralistic and active and broad journalistic spectrum. So I do think that if you are, as a journalist, first committed to reliability and accuracy, then you should be welcome to the party. Not everybody has to have an opinion on everything. But I do believe that what we worry about, what some editors and some news organizations worry about as being bias, is not bias. It's about accuracy versus inaccuracy. As long as I'm not lying to you, and by the way, Yamiche and I work for NBC News. I work for MSNBC, which has the same standards and practices and legal department as NBC News. I have no right to lie to anybody, and if I am caught knowingly lying to my audience, it's entirely possible I'll be fired, probably likely that I'll be fired. So my obligation to my viewership is accuracy and detail and analysis and context. I think that to narrow it down more than that is probably dangerous.
Well, I think that we are out of time, but I think that that was an amazing way to summarize your viewpoint and a bit of what we'll also, which is a lot of what you'll get if you read Small Acts of Courage. And like I said, I know that a lot of you have picked up the paper copy, the physical copy, but listening to Ali, if you've heard him for the last hour, listening to Ali, it really, to me, is also very special. So thank you so much, Ali Velshi.
Thank you for doing this and for being here. And thank you all for being here. And thank you to our wonderful hosts. Nothing is better than sitting amongst books and making sure that these books will be here and available to everybody. So thank you.